For 3 years, Frank Miller had been the invisible man at Springfield Regional Airport, moving luggage from planes to terminals with the steady rhythm of someone who understood that honest work was its own reward. At 78, he was older than most baggage handlers, but he showed up on time, did his job without complaint, and never drew attention to himself. Pilots barely acknowledged him as they walked past, focused on their flight plans. Mechanics saw him as just another ground worker with no technical knowledge. Ground crew supervisors appreciated his reliability, but never thought to ask about his background. Until the stormy Thursday afternoon when a Cessna 172 made an emergency landing with engine trouble that had the airport's best mechanics stumped, and Frank Miller quietly approached the aircraft, put his weathered ear against the cowling, and said words that would change everything. "That's a timing chain issue. Same sound I used to hear in P-51 Mustangs when we were flying combat missions over Germany in 1944. The silence that followed revealed that the man who had been hauling their bags for 3 years was actually a World War II fighter pilot who knew more about aircraft engines than everyone else at the airport combined. Welcome to Forgotten Heroes Stories. Before we continue this incredible story of hidden expertise, aviation legends, and the moment when a small airport discovered they had a flying ace working in their baggage department, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like Frank's deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button. These voices matter, and your support helps us honor the greatest generation. Springfield Regional Airport was a modest facility that served the transportation needs of a mid-sized Ohio city. With 2 runways, a small terminal building, and enough hangar space for a dozen private aircraft, it handled everything from corporate jets to flight training operations, charter flights to emergency medical transports. Frank Miller had started working there in 2010, at age 75, when retirement had become too quiet and his modest pension needed supplementing. The job posting for part-time baggage handler had seemed perfect. Physical work that would keep him active, a chance to be around aircraft again, and a schedule that gave him purpose without overwhelming him. Airport Operations Manager Linda Rodriguez had hired Frank, despite concerns about his age, impressed by his reliability during the interview process and his obvious familiarity with aviation terminology. "Have you worked around airports before?" she'd asked. Frank had simply replied, "I've been around aircraft most of my life," which she'd interpreted as experience with commercial aviation, rather than anything more significant. Frank's duties were straightforward. Transfer luggage and cargo between aircraft and the terminal, assist with ground operations during busy periods, and maintain the cleanliness of the ramp area. He worked Tuesday through Saturday, 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., moving at his own pace, but maintaining the steady productivity that had characterized his entire working life. The other airport employees had quickly categorized Frank as a reliable but unremarkable addition to the team. He wasn't unfriendly, but he kept conversations brief and task-focused. When pilots discussed flight plans or weather conditions, Frank would listen politely but rarely contribute. When mechanics debated aircraft systems or maintenance procedures, he would work quietly nearby without offering opinions. "Frank's a good worker," Linda would tell people who asked about him. "Shows up on time, does his job, never causes problems. He's probably the most dependable employee we have." What Linda and the others didn't know was that Frank Miller's relationship with aircraft went back 70 years, to a time when knowing the difference between engine sounds could mean the difference between life and death, when mechanical expertise was measured not by certificates, but by successful combat missions, and when the rumble of aircraft engines was the soundtrack to the most dangerous work imaginable. Frank's workdays at Springfield Regional Airport followed a predictable pattern that suited his temperament and physical capabilities. He'd arrive at 5:45 a.m., change into his work clothes, and check the daily flight schedule to understand which aircraft would need baggage services. The airport typically handled 15 to 20 operations per day: small private planes, charter flights, flight training aircraft, and the occasional corporate jet. Frank had learned the rhythm of different types of aircraft, how long it took to unload a Cessna 172 versus a King Air, which pilots preferred to handle their own cargo, and which aircraft required special care for delicate equipment. He moved through his work with quiet efficiency, loading and unloading baggage carts, transporting cargo to the terminal, and cleaning up debris that accumulated on the ramp area. His colleagues noticed that Frank seemed unusually comfortable around aircraft. He never flinched when engines started near him, never seemed nervous around spinning propellers, and always seemed to know, intuitively, which direction pilots would taxi their planes. "Frank's got good situational awareness," observed Mike Peterson, the airport's lead mechanic. "Some of these baggage handlers, you have to constantly remind them to stay clear of prop wash or engine intakes. Frank just naturally positions himself safely." But Mike and the other mechanics also noticed that Frank sometimes paused near aircraft with running engines, tilting his head slightly as if listening to something others couldn't hear. When asked about it, Frank would simply say he was checking that everything sounds normal and continue with his work. The pilots who used Springfield Regional regularly had grown accustomed to Frank's presence, but rarely interacted with him beyond polite greetings. To them, he was part of the airport infrastructure, reliable, invisible, and unimportant to their primary concerns of flight safety and schedule adherence. Frank preferred it that way. After decades of carrying responsibility for other people's lives, there was something peaceful about work where success was measured simply by bags reaching their proper destinations and aircraft ramps staying clean and safe. Thursday, September 12th, 2013, brought weather that had been building over the Midwest for 2 days. A slow-moving storm system with heavy rain, gusty winds, and the kind of atmospheric instability that made flight operations challenging, even for experienced pilots. Springfield Regional Airport had been busy since early morning, with aircraft seeking shelter from deteriorating conditions across the region. The terminal was crowded with stranded passengers. The ramp was full of planes that had diverted from their original destinations. And the air traffic control tower was handling more operations than usual as pilots sought safe harbors. Frank was having a busier day than normal, helping to accommodate the additional aircraft and the luggage that came with them. He'd been working steadily since 6 a.m., moving baggage for displaced passengers and helping to secure aircraft against the increasing wind. At 2:15 p.m., just as Frank was preparing to end his shift, the radio in the operations office crackled with an emergency call. "Springfield Tower, Cessna 47 Alpha, declaring emergency, request immediate landing, engine running rough, approximately 5 miles southeast." Linda Rodriguez grabbed the radio and coordinated with the tower, while simultaneously alerting emergency services. Frank, hearing the transmission, delayed his departure and positioned himself where he could observe the incoming aircraft. The Cessna 172 appeared through the gray clouds at 2:23 p.m., its engine sputtering audibly even from a distance. Pilot Jerry Coleman, a flight instructor with 15 years of experience, managed to get the aircraft on the ground safely, but the engine was clearly in distress, running erratically, making unusual noises, and producing more smoke than normal. Coleman shut down the engine immediately after reaching the ramp, but his face showed the stress of someone who had just experienced every pilot's nightmare: engine failure in deteriorating weather conditions with limited options for safe landing sites. Mike Peterson and his maintenance team converged on the aircraft within minutes, opening the engine cowling to begin diagnosing the problem. But after 30 minutes of inspection, testing, and consultation, they were puzzled. The engine showed no obvious signs of mechanical failure, yet it was clearly not running normally. "I've never heard an engine make sounds quite like that," Mike admitted to Linda Rodriguez as they stood beside the disabled Cessna. "It's running, but something's definitely wrong, and I can't pinpoint what it is." That's when Frank Miller, who had been standing quietly nearby, spoke up. "Excuse me," Frank said, approaching the group of mechanics clustered around the Cessna's open engine compartment. "I couldn't help but notice the sound that engine was making when you landed." Mike Peterson looked up from the multimeter he'd been using to check electrical connections. "Yeah, it's definitely not running right, but we can't figure out what's causing it." Frank gestured toward the engine. "Would it be all right if I took a listen?" Mike glanced at Linda Rodriguez, who shrugged. Frank had never shown interest in aircraft maintenance before, but they were running out of options and another opinion couldn't hurt. "Sure, go ahead," Mike said, stepping aside. Frank approached the engine with movements that suddenly seemed less like those of an elderly baggage handler and more like those of someone with deep technical knowledge. He leaned in close to the engine compartment, positioning his ear near different components, while Mike started the engine at idle power. After about 30 seconds of careful listening, Frank straightened up and nodded with the confidence of someone who had identified a familiar problem. "That's a timing issue," he said simply. "Sounds like the magneto timing is off by about 10 degrees. Same noise I used to hear in P-51 Mustangs when we were flying combat missions over Germany in 1944. The silence that followed was profound. Mike Peterson stared at Frank as if seeing him for the first time. Linda Rodriguez felt her mouth drop open. Even Jerry Coleman, the pilot, stopped his post-flight routine to process what he'd just heard. "You flew P-51s?" Mike asked, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and growing respect. Frank nodded matter-of-factly. "352nd Fighter Group, 8th Air Force, 78 combat missions over occupied Europe. But before I was a pilot, I was a mechanic. Had to understand every part of those engines. Our lives depended on them working perfectly." Mike looked back at the Cessna's engine, then at Frank. "You think it's the magneto timing?" "Check the P-lead connection to the left magneto," Frank suggested, "and run a timing light test. I'm betting you'll find it's firing late, probably due to a loose connection that's creating intermittent contact." Mike and his team exchanged glances, then immediately began the diagnostic procedures Frank had suggested. Within 15 minutes, they had confirmed his diagnosis. A left magneto was indeed firing late due to a loose connection that had worked itself free during flight, creating the erratic engine performance that had forced the emergency landing. "How did you know that just from listening?" Mike asked as he tightened the connection that would solve the problem. Frank smiled slightly. "When you've heard thousands of aircraft engines under every possible condition, from takeoff power to combat emergency situations, you learn to recognize what different problems sound like. Engine sounds were as important as visual instruments when you're flying over enemy territory." Word of Frank's aircraft diagnosis spread through Springfield Regional Airport with the speed that remarkable news travels in small, tight-knit communities. Within an hour, pilots, mechanics, ground crew, and administrative staff had all heard some version of the story. The elderly baggage handler was actually a World War II fighter pilot who had just solved an engine problem that had stumped the airport's best mechanics. But rather than reveling in the attention, Frank seemed slightly uncomfortable with the sudden interest in his background. When approached by curious staff members, he deflected questions and tried to return focus to his normal work duties. "Mr. Miller," Linda Rodriguez said, finding Frank in the break room where he was quietly eating his lunch, "I think we need to talk." Frank looked up from his sandwich. Is there a problem with my work, Mrs. Rodriguez? Quite the opposite, Linda replied, sitting down across from him. Frank, in 3 years of working here, you never mentioned that you were a pilot. A fighter pilot. In World War II. Frank set down his sandwich and considered his response. You hired me to handle baggage, not to talk about ancient history. My military service ended 70 years ago. But you clearly still have knowledge and skills that could be valuable here. Why didn't you ever mention your aviation background? Frank was quiet for a moment, then answered with characteristic honesty. Because I wanted to work, not be treated like a museum piece. I've seen what happens when old veterans start talking about their war stories. People either get uncomfortable or they want to turn you into some kind of hero. I just wanted to do my job and be useful. Linda leaned forward. Frank, what you did today, diagnosing that engine problem, that wasn't ancient history. That was current, relevant expertise that saved a pilot from potentially serious problems. Any good mechanic could have figured it out eventually, Frank replied modestly. But you figured it out immediately, just by listening. That's not just mechanical knowledge. That's experience that can't be taught in any training program. Mike Peterson appeared in the break room doorway, clearly having been looking for Frank. Sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to thank you for the help with that Cessna. The engine's running perfectly now. Frank nodded. Glad it worked out. Mike hesitated, then asked the question that had been nagging at him. Frank, how many different types of aircraft have you worked on? Frank thought for a moment. During the war, P-51 Mustangs primarily, but also P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, and various support aircraft. After the war, I worked on civilian aircraft for a few years, before getting into the Postal Service. You were a civilian aircraft mechanic too? For about 10 years, 1946 to 1956. Worked at a small airport in Virginia, maintaining everything from Piper Cubs to early jets. But the Postal Service offered better stability for a family man. Mike's respect was evident in his voice. Frank, we could really use someone with your knowledge and experience in our maintenance department. Would you consider transferring from baggage handling to mechanic work? Frank looked surprised by the offer. Mike, I'm 78 years old. I haven't held an A&P license in 60 years. You don't need current certification to work as a maintenance assistant, Linda interjected. And your diagnostic skills are clearly still sharp. Frank considered the proposal, then smiled slightly. I suppose it would be nice to work with engines again. Frank Miller's transition from baggage handler to maintenance assistant at Springfield Regional Airport happened gradually over the next few weeks. Linda Rodriguez and Mike Peterson were careful not to overwhelm him with responsibilities, but they quickly discovered that Frank's knowledge of aircraft systems was both deep and practical. It's like having a walking encyclopedia of aviation history, Mike explained to the other mechanics. But more than that, he understands the fundamental principles that haven't changed, even as technology has advanced. Frank's approach to aircraft maintenance was methodical and thorough, reflecting both his military training and decades of experience with mechanical systems. He would listen to engines with the focused attention of someone whose life had once depended on recognizing subtle variations in sound. He would examine components with hands that had learned to identify problems through touch as much as sight. But what impressed his younger colleagues most was Frank's ability to teach without condescending. When newer mechanics encountered unfamiliar problems, Frank would guide them through diagnostic procedures, explaining not just what to check, but why certain symptoms indicated specific issues. The thing about aircraft engines, Frank told Tom Bradley, a recently certified mechanic, is that they're honest. They tell you exactly what's wrong if you know how to listen. Every sound, every vibration, every change in performance is information. Tom had been struggling with a persistent problem in a Piper Cherokee's engine that ran rough during climb but smoothed out at cruise power. Frank listened to the engine for less than a minute before suggesting they check the fuel flow to individual cylinders. "How did you know to check that?" Tom asked after they'd found and corrected the partially blocked fuel injector that was causing the problem. "Because that's exactly how a P-51 would behave when one cylinder wasn't getting proper fuel flow during high power settings," Frank explained. "The principle hasn't changed, just the specific components." Word of Frank's expertise began to spread beyond Springfield Regional Airport. Pilots from other airports started asking for his opinion on difficult maintenance issues. Aircraft owners sought his advice on purchasing decisions. Even certified mechanics with decades of experience found themselves consulting the elderly man who could diagnose problems by sound alone. One afternoon in late October, a flight training school brought several student pilots to Springfield Regional Airport for a maintenance demonstration that was part of their curriculum. The instructor, Captain Sarah Williams, had arranged for Mike Peterson to explain basic aircraft systems and common mechanical issues. Frank was working nearby, inspecting the ignition system on a Cessna 152, when he overheard Captain Williams explaining magneto function to her students. "The magneto system provides electrical power to the spark plugs," she was saying. "It's independent of the aircraft's electrical system, which provides redundancy for engine ignition." One of the students raised his hand. "Captain Williams, how can you tell if a magneto is failing?" Before the instructor could answer, Frank spoke up from his position at the nearby aircraft. "May I?" he asked politely. Captain Williams, recognizing Frank from his reputation around the airport, nodded encouragingly. Frank straightened up and approached the group of students. "The best way to detect magneto problems is through sound and engine performance checks," he began. "During your run-up, when you switch from both magnetos to left magneto only, you're listening for specific changes." He walked to the Cessna 152 he'd been working on and gestured for the students to gather around. "In a properly functioning system, you'll hear a slight reduction in RPM when you go from both magnetos to single magneto operation. That's normal. But if you hear rough running, significant power loss, or irregular firing, that indicates a problem with the magneto you're testing." Frank started the engine and demonstrated the magneto check, letting each student listen to the sound differences and observe the RPM changes on the tachometer. "Now," Frank continued, after shutting down the engine, "during World War II, we didn't always have the luxury of proper run-up areas or ideal testing conditions. Sometimes you had to diagnose magneto problems while under fire, with engine noise, and in aircraft that had been damaged by enemy action." The students listened with rapt attention as Frank described techniques for identifying engine problems during combat operations, when mechanical failure could mean the difference between completing a mission and being shot down over enemy territory. "The principle I want you to understand," Frank concluded, "is that your aircraft will always tell you what's wrong if you develop the ability to listen and interpret what you're hearing. That skill could save your life someday." Captain Williams was impressed not just by Frank's technical knowledge, but by his teaching ability. After the students left, she approached him with a request. "Mr. Miller, would you be willing to speak to our students on a regular basis? Not just about maintenance, but about aviation decision-making, risk management, and the kind of practical knowledge that comes from real-world experience." Frank considered the request. "I'm not a certificated flight instructor, Captain Williams. But you have something that can't be learned from textbooks. Judgment developed through experience in situations where mistakes had life or death consequences. That's exactly what these young pilots need to hear." Frank agreed to occasional guest lectures, and his presentations became some of the most popular and impactful sessions in the flight school's curriculum. Frank Miller's transformation from anonymous baggage handler to respected aviation expert at Springfield Regional Airport didn't go unnoticed by the broader aviation community. Local flying clubs began inviting him to speak at their meetings. Aviation museums requested his participation in educational programs. Even professional organizations recognized the value of his knowledge and experience. But the recognition that meant the most to Frank came from an unexpected source. A letter from Jerry Coleman, the pilot whose emergency landing had first revealed Frank's expertise. "Mr. Miller," Coleman wrote, "I wanted to thank you again for diagnosing the problem with my Cessna. But more than that, I wanted you to know that your quick identification of the issue prevented what could have been a catastrophic failure. The loose magneto connection you found was getting worse, and my mechanic said it probably would have failed completely within a few more hours of operation. If that had happened while I was flying passengers or students, the outcome could have been tragic." Frank kept the letter, but didn't share it publicly. When Mike Peterson asked about it, Frank simply said, "That's why we do this work, to keep people safe in the air." The most meaningful recognition, however, came from his fellow mechanics and the pilots who worked at Springfield Regional Airport. They had learned to value not just Frank's technical knowledge, but his approach to aviation: methodical, safety-focused, and grounded in respect for the serious responsibility that comes with maintaining aircraft. "Frank has taught all of us to listen more carefully," Mike Peterson explained to a visiting FAA inspector. "Not just to engines, but to pilots' concerns, to aircraft behavior, to all the subtle signs that indicate potential problems before they become dangerous." The inspector, who had heard about Frank's reputation, was curious about his background. "How long has he been working in aviation maintenance?" Mike smiled. "Continuously since 1943. With a break for military service. Military service in aviation, fighter pilot, P-51 Mustangs, 78 combat missions over Europe." Inspector's expression changed from professional interest to genuine respect. "And he's working as a maintenance assistant? He says he likes keeping busy and staying around aircraft," Mike replied. "But we all know we're learning from someone who represents the foundation of American aviation expertise." Frank Miller continued working at Springfield Regional Airport until he was 83 years old, finally retiring in 2015 when his physician recommended reducing his physical activity. During his final 2 years in maintenance, he had trained 3 younger mechanics, consulted on dozens of difficult diagnostic problems, and helped establish safety procedures that became models for other small airports. His retirement party was held in the airport's main hangar, attended by pilots, mechanics, airport staff, and aviation enthusiasts from across the region. But the most touching tribute came from the group of flight students who had learned from his guest lectures over the years. "Mr. Frank taught us that being a pilot isn't just about knowing how to fly," said Rebecca Martinez, now a certified flight instructor herself. "It's about understanding aircraft as complete systems, respecting the responsibility that comes with aviation, and developing the judgment to make good decisions when things don't go according to plan." Frank's response to the tributes was characteristically modest. "I was fortunate to work in a field I loved, with people who appreciated the knowledge I could share. That's all anyone can ask for, the chance to be useful and to help others stay safe." But Frank's impact extended beyond the mechanics he had trained and the pilots he had helped. His example had shown the aviation community at Springfield Regional Airport that expertise comes in many forms, that experience is often more valuable than credentials, and that some of the most important knowledge is carried by people who work quietly and without fanfare. The maintenance department established a small library of technical manuals and historical aviation resources in Frank's honor. But the real memorial to his service was the approach to aircraft maintenance that he had modeled: thorough, thoughtful, and always focused on safety above all other considerations. Frank showed us that maintaining aircraft isn't just about fixing problems, Mike Peterson explained to new mechanics who joined the team after Frank's retirement. It's about preventing problems through understanding, experience, and respect for the responsibility we carry every time we sign off on an aircraft as airworthy. Even after his retirement, Frank Miller's influence continued to shape operations at Springfield Regional Airport. The diagnostic techniques he had taught became standard procedures. The safety protocols he had recommended were adopted airport-wide. Most importantly, the culture of careful listening and thorough analysis that he had modeled became the standard approach to aircraft maintenance. Young mechanics who had learned from Frank found themselves passing on his lessons to the next generation of aviation professionals. Frank always said that aircraft engines are honest became a common phrase in the maintenance department. They'll tell you exactly what's wrong if you know how to listen. The flight school incorporated Frank's guest lectures into their permanent curriculum, using recordings of his presentations to teach students about aviation decision-making, risk management, and the importance of understanding aircraft systems at a fundamental level. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Frank's legacy was the reminder that expertise and experience often hide in unexpected places. His story encouraged aviation professionals to look beyond credentials and titles to recognize knowledge wherever it might be found. Frank Miller taught us all a valuable lesson, Linda Rodriguez reflected years later. The person sweeping the hangar might be a former test pilot. The part-time worker might have more experience than anyone else on the field. Real expertise doesn't always come with fancy titles or impressive offices. The story of Springfield Regional Airport's baggage handler, who turned out to be a World War II fighter pilot, became part of aviation folklore, shared at fly-ins and professional conferences, as an example of how the aviation community benefits when it recognizes and values experience in all its forms. Frank's approach to aircraft maintenance, combining deep technical knowledge with practical experience and unwavering focus on safety, became a model that other airports and maintenance organizations sought to emulate. When Frank Miller died peacefully in 2018, at the age of 85, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched through his aviation expertise. Pilots flew in from across the region to honor the man who had helped keep them safe in the air. The memorial service included a flyover by 3 P-51 Mustangs, the same type of aircraft Frank had flown in combat 75 years earlier. As the formation passed over the cemetery, those who knew Frank understood that the tribute represented not just his military service, but his lifelong commitment to aviation safety and excellence. The heroes of the greatest generation didn't stop serving when World War II ended. They carried their skills, their knowledge, and their commitment to excellence into civilian careers where they continued to make a difference in ways both visible and invisible. Frank Miller's story reminds us that expertise earned under the most demanding conditions doesn't fade with age. It deepens into wisdom that can save lives and solve problems that stump younger, more credentialed professionals. The elderly baggage handler at your local airport might be a former test pilot. The part-time mechanic might have experience that spans the entire history of aviation. But this story is also about recognition, understanding that knowledge and experience often hide in unexpected places, carried by people who prefer doing important work to talking about their impressive backgrounds. Frank Miller spent 3 years moving luggage before anyone thought to ask about his aviation experience. Yet his expertise had been available all along. How many other Frank Millers work in our airports, our maintenance shops, our technical industries? How many problems could be solved more quickly if we took the time to learn about the backgrounds and experiences of the people around us? How much wisdom is walking among us, unrecognized because it doesn't come with contemporary credentials or fancy titles? The next time you interact with an older worker, whether they're handling baggage, sweeping floors, or performing routine tasks, consider that they might be carrying decades of expertise that could be invaluable in the right situation. Their hands might remember skills learned in circumstances that tested the limits of human capability. Share in the comments. Have you ever discovered that someone's background was far more impressive than their current job suggested? Have you witnessed a moment when someone's hidden expertise solved a problem that stumped the experts? Let this be a place where we celebrate the knowledge and experience that walks among us every day. Subscribe to Forgotten Heroes Stories If you believe that wisdom comes in many forms, and that the most valuable expertise is often carried by those who prefer action to recognition, hit that notification bell so you never miss the stories that remind us to look beyond the surface and appreciate the depth of experience that surrounds us. Tomorrow, we'll share another story of hidden expertise and quiet excellence. Until then, remember, the most important knowledge is often carried by the people we notice least, and the greatest experts are often those who let their work speak for itself. Thank you for listening. Thank you for recognizing. And thank you for understanding that true expertise is measured not by titles or credentials, but by the ability to solve problems, keep people safe, and share knowledge with the next generation.